Imagine closing your eyes right now, and when you open them, you are no longer in your bedroom, no longer in your city, no longer in your century. You are standing barefoot on warm cobblestones, and the smell of salt water and cedar wood and something faintly sweet, like figs warming in the sun, is drifting past your face on a morning breeze. The sky above you is the kind of deep, impossible blue that you only ever see in old paintings or in dreams. And the city around you is alive, but not in the loud, rushing, urgent way that modern life is alive. It is alive in a slower, older way, a way that your bones somehow already remember. This is Carthage, and nobody is about to go to war. Nobody is about to give a great speech. Nobody is about to change the course of history. The man walking past you right now, with a clay pot balanced on his shoulder and dust on his sandals, he is simply going home. And that, if you will allow yourself to settle in and let your breathing slow down, that is exactly the kind of story we are going to follow tonight. You do not need to do anything. You do not need to remember any dates or names or battles. All you need to do is stay right here, in this warm, ancient city, and let the day unfold the way it always has, slowly, gently, and with no particular hurry at all. There is a man named Hanno. He is not a general. He is not a merchant prince or a senator or a priest of great power. He is a potter. He lives in a narrow house on a winding street not far from the lower harbor, and every single morning of his life, he wakes up before the sun has fully decided to rise. His wife, Elissa, named after the legendary founder-queen of this city, which is a name so common in Carthage that there are probably 4 Elissas on their street alone. She is already awake beside him, or sometimes already up, already moving quietly through the back of the house where the clay jars and water vessels are stored. Their daughter, a small girl of about 7 years whose name is Tanit, after the great goddess, is still asleep on her mat, her dark hair spread around her face like a small, still pool of water. Their son, a boy of maybe 12 named Mago, is technically asleep, but has a habit of lying awake staring at the ceiling beams in the quiet gray time before dawn, thinking about things that 12-year-old boys in any century think about, which is to say, nothing in particular and everything at once. The house they live in is not large, but it is theirs, and it is solid, and it has stood for a long time. The walls are made of mud brick, plastered over and whitewashed, and in the heat of summer the plaster holds the coolness of the night for a few extra hours into the morning, which is something Hanno is always quietly grateful for. The floor of the main room is packed earth, worn so smooth by years of bare feet that it has taken on almost the quality of stone. There is a low table. There are cushions and woven mats. There are clay oil lamps, their wicks made of twisted plant fiber, their small flames already gone cold from the night before. Along one wall there are shelves, and on the shelves there are pots and jars, some of them made by Hanno himself, some of them traded from neighbors. One of them, a beautiful red-glazed amphora with 2 handles, brought back years ago by a cousin who sailed as far as the island the Greeks call Sicily. That jar holds dried lentils, and Elissa will not let anyone use it for anything else, because it is too beautiful to waste on something ordinary, and also because if you put lentils in a beautiful jar, then somehow the lentils themselves feel like something worth having. The city begins to wake in layers, and Hanno, lying still for just another moment on his sleeping mat, can hear it happening outside the high, narrow window above him. First there is nothing. Then there is the sound of a single donkey, somewhere. It's called cutting through the silence like something dropped in a quiet room. Then there are footsteps on the cobblestones outside, 1 person, then 2, then a murmur of voices. Then the creak of a wooden shutter somewhere down the street. Then the smell of smoke, thin and pale, as the first cooking fires of the morning are lit in the street-side braziers and the small clay ovens tucked into the alcoves of the ground-floor shops. The city does not explode into wakefulness. It seeps into it, and Hanno lets it seep into him too, just for another breath or two, before he pushes himself upright and reaches for his tunic. His tunic is made of linen, undyed, the color of dry sand, and it falls to just below his knees. Over it, when the weather is cooler, he wears a shorter rectangular piece of wool cloth draped over one shoulder. A garment so simple that you might not even think of it as a garment at all, just a piece of cloth that has decided to spend its life attached to a person. His sandals are leather, repaired twice, the right one more than the left because he favors his right foot when he walks, a habit he has had since childhood. He has a small bronze pin that he uses to fasten the shoulder cloth. It was his father's. He does not think about this every morning. But on mornings when he is moving a little slower, a little more gently through the house, he sometimes holds it for a moment longer than he needs to before pressing it closed. Elissa has already set out bread. The bread is flat and round, made from emmer wheat ground on the stone quern that sits in the back corner of the house, the grinding of which is one of those household tasks that produces a sound so familiar to everyone in the neighborhood that nobody consciously hears it anymore. The bread is slightly charred on one side because the clay griddle runs hot at the center, and Hanno always eats the charred side without comment because Elissa already knows about the griddle and feels no need to be reminded. Alongside the bread there is a small bowl of olive oil for dipping, a handful of dried figs, and a clay cup of something that is not quite wine and not quite water, but is a diluted mixture of the two, thinned enough for morning, which is when you want your head clear for work. Hanno eats standing up because sitting down to eat in the morning feels, to him, like a commitment to slowness that the day has not yet earned. Mago appears from the back room, rubbing his face, his hair pressed flat on one side. He tears off a piece of bread and eats it in 3 bites and reaches for another piece, and Elissa says something to him without looking up, and he slows down slightly, which is not really slowing down, but is a performance of slowing down that fools no one. Tanit is still asleep. She will sleep until the noise of the street becomes too interesting to ignore, and then she will appear in the doorway of the back room with the alert, bright eyes of a child who has been pretending to sleep for some time already. The workshop is attached to the house, accessible through an interior doorway that Hanno has to duck through because the lintel was built for someone slightly shorter. This is the room where Hanno's day really begins. It smells of wet clay and dry clay and the mineral, ancient smell of the earth itself, and also faintly of the wood ash that gets mixed into some clay preparations to improve their texture, and faintly of the olive oil that Hanno rubs into his hands before he starts working to keep the skin from drying and cracking. The wheel is in the center of the room. It is a heavy stone disc mounted on a wooden pivot, and Hanno turns it with his foot while his hands shape whatever is above it. And he has been doing this for so long that the motion of his foot and the motion of his hands are not two separate things, but one continuous thing, like breathing. He sits at the wheel and wets his hands from the clay-gray water bucket beside him and centers a mound of prepared clay with a few practiced movements. Then he begins. And this is the part that, if you are watching him from the doorway, is almost hypnotic. His hands move over the rising, spinning clay with such calm confidence that it does not look like work at all. It looks like conversation. The clay rises and opens, and Hanno presses inward here, lifts outward there, thins the walls with the tips of his fingers while his other hand steadies the outside, and within a time that is difficult to measure, because watching it somehow removes you from the regular passage of minutes. A vessel begins to exist where before there was only a shapeless mound. A jar, a water pot, the upper opening still rough and unfinished, to be trimmed later when it firms to leather hardness, but already recognizably, unmistakably itself. Hanno makes perhaps 30 or 40 pieces on a good day. Not all of them will survive the firing. Some will crack, some will warp, some will emerge from the kiln with a flaw that makes them saleable as second-quality goods, but not as the good work he takes pride in. The good work, the pieces he is genuinely pleased with, he stacks carefully in the corner of the workshop to dry for several days before they go into the kiln. The kiln is outside, in the small courtyard shared with two neighboring families. And firing day is a communal occasion that involves careful management of the fire temperature and a certain amount of anxious watching, and, when it goes well, a quiet collective satisfaction that feels, in a small way, like something worth celebrating. The street outside Hanno's workshop becomes genuinely busy by mid-morning. Carthage, even at this level, even on this ordinary street in this ordinary neighborhood that is not the Grand Harbor District or the wealthy hilltop neighborhoods where the great merchant families live, Carthage is a city of layers and movement and sound. There are water carriers, men and boys who ferry large clay amphorae from the public cisterns to households and workshops that need water delivered, moving through the streets with the trained, balanced gait of people who have been carrying heavy things on their heads and shoulders for years. There are food sellers, women and men both, with flat baskets of bread or dried fish or olives or soft cheese wrapped in cloth, calling out in a mix of Punic, which is the Carthaginian language, descended from the Phoenician tongue of their ancestors, and occasionally a word or phrase of Libyan or Greek, or even the lilting trade tongue that has no real name, but that everyone who does business in the harbor district seems to know enough of to get by. There are children who are supposed to be on errands, and children who have abandoned their errands. There are dogs, the skinny, sand-colored dogs of ancient Mediterranean cities, who live in that permanent middle state between belonging to everyone and belonging to no one, and who have learned every doorstep and scrap of shade in the neighborhood. Mago will spend part of his morning at the small school that meets in the house of an old scholar 3 streets away. Carthaginian literacy is not universal, but it is widespread enough that a working craftsman like Hanno sees value in having his son able to read and write in Punic, which uses an alphabet descended from the Phoenician script, a script that is one of the ancestors of the alphabet you are reading in right now. In this very sentence, though neither Hanno nor Mago could have imagined such a thing. The school is informal by any later standard. The old scholar, a man with a long gray beard and the deliberate manner of someone who has decided to move through the world at his own pace regardless of what the world thinks about it, teaches perhaps 12 or 15 boys at a time, using wooden boards covered in wax for practice writing, and using stories and recitations for everything else. Mago does not love school the way some boys seem to love it, but he is good at numbers, which the old scholar says is a gift from Balhammon himself, and this makes him feel, on balance, that the mornings are worthwhile. Tanit's morning takes place mostly in the immediate vicinity of the house and the courtyard and the street directly outside. She is 7 years old, and the neighborhood is her world, which means she knows it with the deep, granular intimacy that only children and very old people who never leave their neighborhoods ever know a place. She knows which crack in the paving stone by the corner shop has a spider living in it, and what kind of spider it is, and roughly how large it has grown since last she checked. She knows that the woman in the house with the blue-painted doorframe sometimes gives figs to children who knock and ask politely, and she knows which children have already knocked too many times this week and will be turned away. She knows the schedule of the water carrier who comes to their street, and she knows that if you offer to help him hold the rope that steadies the large amphora on his donkey, he will sometimes let you have a small pour of cool water directly into your cupped hands, which tastes better than any water poured into a cup, for reasons that no one has ever been able to explain to her satisfaction. Elissa's morning is the kind of morning that does not look like a great deal from the outside, but from the inside is a sustained, skilled act of management. She keeps the household accounts in her head, because writing them down is something she can do but finds slower than simply holding them. She knows how much oil is in the storage jar, how many days the remaining lentils represent if portioned sensibly, how much will she has promised to the weaving cooperative 3 streets away, when Hanno last sold a good batch at the market, and when the money from that will stop being enough to cover what they need. She is not anxious about these things in the way that anxiety feels from the outside. She is simply aware of them, the way a sailor is aware of the weather, not constantly alarmed by it. but never entirely not watching it either. She will spend part of her morning at the communal grinding stone in the courtyard with the other women of the shared houses, turning grain into flour in the slow, rhythmic, two-handed motion that produces a fine white dust, and also, almost as a byproduct, conversation. The conversation that happens at the grinding stone covers everything. It covers who is sick on the next street over, and what remedy has been suggested. It covers whether the olive oil from the new supplier is as good as the old supplier's oil, which it is not, in a way that is subtle but definite. It covers a rumor about the new temple construction on the hill, and whether the priests involved are the honest sort or not. It covers a daughter's marriage prospect, a son's misbehavior, a neighbor's good fortune, a neighbor's bad fortune, the weather, the price of fish, the color of someone's new door paint, and the dream that one woman had last week that everyone agrees sounds significant, but no one can quite interpret. By the time the sun is fully high and the shadows have pulled themselves tight against the bases of the walls where the narrow streets offer almost no shade at all, Carthage has reached that particular point in the Mediterranean day when the heat becomes a kind of presence in itself. Not violent, not unpleasant exactly, but definite. The heat of a summer afternoon in this city is something that presses gently against every surface and asks that you slow down, sit down, be still for a while. And the city, which has been alive in this climate for centuries, obliges. The workshop's quiet. The street sellers find doorways. The water carrier settles his donkey in the shadow of a tall building and sits against the wall with his eyes half closed. Even the dogs find their bits of shade and become very serious about occupying them. Hanno stops working at the wheel sometime around midday. His hands are gray with dried clay to the elbows, and his lower back has the deep, comfortable ache of a morning's work well done. He washes his hands at the water basin in the courtyard, a slow, deliberate process that involves working the clay out from under his fingernails and from the creased skin of his knuckles, which takes longer than you would think. Then he goes inside, where Elissa has set out the midday meal, and he sits down on the cushion by the low table and allows himself to be properly still for the first time since before dawn. The midday meal is more substantial than the morning bread. There is porridge made from spelt grain, thick and warm, seasoned with salt and a little olive oil. There is dried fish, salty and dense, the kind that keeps for weeks without spoiling and that has the strong, direct flavor of the sea itself. There are olives, green ones from the jar. There is more bread, the good flat bread that Elissa makes better than anyone on their street and that the neighbors sometimes trade small services to obtain. There may be, on a good market day, a piece of soft goat cheese, pale and mild, that Tanit will eat first from whatever she has been given, picking it out with the focused attention of a jeweler selecting stones. They eat together when the family is all home, which at midday they often are, Mago back from the morning school, Tanit in from the street, Hanno from the workshop, Elissa having sat down for the first time in hours. They do not eat in silence exactly, but they do not eat in great ceremony or conversation either. It is the meal of people who have been working since before the sun rose fully and who will work again afterward, and who understand, without needing to say so, that this pause is a kind of gift that the day offers and that one should receive it without drama. After the midday meal, the long quiet of the afternoon, Hanno will rest for perhaps an hour, maybe a little more, on his mat in the back room, the high narrow window admitting a wedge of white-hot afternoon light that falls across the floor and does not reach him where he lies. He does not always sleep, but he always rests, and the distinction matters. Sleeping is when your mind goes away. Resting is when your mind stays but stops insisting on anything. In the resting hour, Hanno sometimes thinks about the jar he is working on, about the angle of the shoulder of it, about whether the lip is the right width. Sometimes he thinks about nothing at all that he could describe afterward. Sometimes he hears the city through the thick walls and high window as a distant, muffled music, the donkey, the voices, the occasional ring of a metal tool against stone somewhere in the distance, the complex sound of children doing something that involves running, and he lets it be the sound of ordinary life doing what ordinary life does, which is to say, continuing steadily, without needing anything from him. Elissa does not rest in the afternoon. This is not a matter of endurance so much as temperament. The afternoon is when she does the work that requires the quiet of the city's pause, the fine weaving, if there is a commission on, or the mending of clothes, or the accounting in her head of what needs to be purchased at the market the next morning and what can wait another few days. She sits in the doorway of the house, in the narrow stripe of shade offered by the overhang of the upper floor of the house next door, and her hands move and her eyes are sometimes on her work and sometimes on the quiet street, and she is, in a way that she would not describe in these terms, but that is nonetheless true, content. Tanit sleeps in the afternoon the way children sleep, completely and suddenly, as if sleep were a decision made by the body without consulting the mind at all. One moment she is sitting in the corner of the courtyard sorting pebbles by size, which is an activity she has invented for herself and finds absorbing. The next moment she is lying down with her cheek against the warm, packed earth, her sorted pebbles arranged in a patient line beside her, and she is deeply, entirely asleep. The courtyard cat, a gray and white creature of considerable dignity and uncertain ownership, steps carefully around her and settles nearby with the air of a chaperone who has seen this before. The afternoon moves slowly. The light shifts from white to gold as the sun begins its long descent over the western hills. The city cools fractionally, enough to feel, and the sounds of work resume. Hanno returns to the workshop and works at the trimming and finishing of the morning's pieces, the quieter and more precise part of the work, shaving the dried but not quite dry clay with a wooden tool to smooth the bases and refine the rims. Mago has afternoon duties of his own, assisting in the workshop for a portion of the afternoon as part of his education in his father's trade, though it is not yet settled whether he will follow Hanno into pottery or take some other direction. The old scholar at the school thinks Mago's head for numbers might suit him to the merchant business, or to work in one of the counting houses near the harbor, and Hanno does not discourage this thought, because the truth is that a life of pottery is a good life, but a difficult one, and a son with choices is a better positioned son than a son with only one path. The harbor district is not far from where Hanno lives, and in the late afternoon, when the worst of the heat has passed, there is often an occasion to walk in that direction for some purpose, picking up a tool from the metalsmith, delivering a finished batch of small oil lamps to the lamp dealer, or simply going because the harbor is the center of this city's heart, and there is always something worth seeing there. Carthage has one of the most remarkable harbor systems in the ancient world. There is the commercial harbor, open and busy, where the broad-bellied merchant ships come and go with their cargoes of tin from beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and glass from the Levant coast, and purple-dyed cloth, and grain, and oil, and wine, and the 100 other goods that make Carthage the center of a trading web that stretches across the known world. And then, behind it, connected by a channel, there is the naval harbor, the circular military harbor with its central island where the admiral's headquarters stand, the place with the ship sheds arranged around the inner ring, each one housing a warship that sits in its stone cradle like a sleeping animal. The naval harbor is not always accessible to ordinary people, and on most afternoons Hanno does not go near it. But the commercial harbor is his and everyone's, and on a good afternoon it smells of salt and tar and fish and spices, and the particular mineral smell of stone heated all day by the sun, and it sounds like several different languages being spoken simultaneously by people who have, through long practice, stopped needing to fully understand each other. The ships in the commercial harbor range from small coastal traders, boats of modest size that carry goods between Carthage and the nearby farming towns along the coast, to the great round-hulled merchant ships that have crossed open water and show it in their worn, salt-stained sides and their patched and repatched canvas sails. The sailors on these ships are drawn from everywhere. There are men from the Greek colonies to the east, tanned and sun-bleached, who speak in the rapid musical Greek of the western settlements. There are Libyan men from the mainland territories under Carthaginian influence, darker-skinned and quiet, experts in the desert trade routes that bring the interior's goods to the coast. There are Sicilian craftsmen and Sardinian miners and men from Spain who speak a language that no one else seems to know and who get along through pointing and hand gestures and the universal language of numbers. And there are the Carthaginian captains themselves, the men who have made this crossing before and will make it again, who carry in their heads the knowledge of currents and stars and seasonal winds and the locations of invisible rocks below calm-looking water, and who are, in their own way, a kind of walking library of the world's geography. Hanno does not envy the sailors. He is a man whose contentment is rooted, literally, in earth and clay, and the idea of weeks at sea, beyond sight of land, with nothing but water in every direction, is not something he finds appealing. But he respects them in the specific way that one craftsman respects another whose craft he could not do himself. The sailors who bring the raw materials that keep cities like this one alive are doing something as essential as what any potter or baker or weaver does, just at a larger scale, and with less sleep and more salt in their hair. There is a fish market near the harbor that does most of its business in the late afternoon, when the fishing boats that went out before dawn have returned. Their catch is sorted and arranged on low stone tables under linen awnings. The fish of the Mediterranean, at this time in history, are extraordinarily plentiful by any later standard, and the variety available on any given afternoon is the kind of thing that would make a modern fishmonger slightly melancholy for contrast. There are large tuna, heavy and dark-fleshed, some of them so big that 2 men carry them on a pole. There are mackerel in their brilliant, iridescent colors, heaped in glistening piles. There are sea bream and red mullet, the red mullet being particularly prized and priced accordingly. There are squid and octopus, the octopus sometimes still moving in a way that small children observe with fascinated horror. There are clams and mussels, and in season, the sea urchins whose orange interior is considered by many in this city to be one of the finest things you can eat, though this is not a universal opinion. Elissa will sometimes send Hanno to the fish market in the late afternoon with specific instructions about what to buy and what price is acceptable, and under no circumstances to be talked into paying more than the stated amount by any fisherman whose persuasiveness exceeds his product's value, which in her experience is most of them. The market negotiation itself is a small performance, understood by both sides as such. The fisherman names a price that is too high. Hanno names a price that is too low. They meet somewhere in the middle, not quite at the midpoint, with the final price depending on who seems more indifferent to the outcome. Hanno has learned, through years of practice, that the key to market negotiation is genuine willingness to walk away. Not the performance of willingness to walk away, but the actual thing, the actual turning of your body toward the next stall and your mind toward the next option. The fishermen respect this because they practice the same thing, and the small daily dramas of market commerce are, in their way, one of the city's many little theaters. On the walk back from the harbor or the market, Hanno sometimes pauses at the small public fountain near the intersection of 2 main streets where the neighborhood's social life has a kind of informal gathering place. This fountain is not grand. It is a stone basin fed by a channel from the city's water system, and around it, especially in the cooler part of the afternoon, there are always people. Old men sitting on the low stone wall beside it, talking about whatever old men talk about in every century, which includes what things used to cost, what the young generation does not understand, what the weather is doing wrong, and who has died recently. Women filling water jugs, often in groups. Their conversation not stopping for the filling of the jugs but continuing around it, threading through the lifting and pouring and balancing in the practiced way of people for whom physical work and social conversation have never been separate things. Children sitting on the rim of the basin with their feet dangling, being told not to put their feet in the fountain and putting them in the fountain. A dog watching the children with an expression of professional assessment, calculating whether any of them looks likely to drop food. Hanno pauses here not because he particularly needs to stop, but because the fountain is the kind of place where you run into the people you meant to speak to and have not gotten around to. And because the cold water splashed on your face and wrists at the end of an afternoon's work is one of those small sensory events that punches above its weight in terms of making you feel like a person who is, on balance, doing fine. He speaks to a neighbor who wants to commission a set of water jars for a new household, and they discuss the size and style and price in the casual, unhurried way of a negotiation that both parties already know will end in agreement. Because the neighbor is honest and Hanno is fair, and they have lived 3 streets from each other for 15 years. He nods to the old men on the wall, one of whom is his father's former friend and who always asks about Hanno's mother, who has been dead for 6 years, with the gentle, slightly forgetful affection of someone who is not entirely certain of the timeline, but means very well. He fills his small clay cup from the fountain and drinks it standing up, watching the street. The street in the late afternoon is its own kind of beautiful. The light at this hour in this city is golden in the particular way of stone and white plaster in the Mediterranean, where the angle of the sun and the particular warmth of the local limestone conspire to make the ordinary surfaces of walls and pavements glow in a way that makes everything look slightly more than itself. The shadows are long and the colors are rich, and even the dust hanging in the air above the unpaved sections of the street catches the light and turns it into something soft and amber. A cat crosses the street with the air of someone who has important business elsewhere. 2 boys race past without looking at anyone. A woman carries a basket of laundry on her head with her hands free and her posture as straight as a column. An old man shuffles past with a stick, looking at the pavement with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the pavement is where all the important information is. Hanno heads home, and as he walks the last few streets to his own door, the evening cooking smells begin to layer themselves over the afternoon's heat. Bread on the griddle again, and something with onions, and somewhere, the sharper smell of roasting meat, which means someone on this street is having a better evening than usual. His own door is the one with the small carved relief beside it, a simple image of the sign of Tanit, the goddess, placed there when the house was first occupied by his parents, who built it, or rather had it built, in the time of Hanno's early childhood. He touches it as he goes in, not from religious devotion exactly, though there is some of that, but from the simple habit of acknowledgement, the same gesture his mother made and his father made, and that Hanno makes without thinking, the way you touch a familiar rail when you go up familiar stairs. The evening meal is the fullest meal of the day, and the preparation of it is Elissa's daily masterwork, though she would find the description excessive. After dinner, the lamps burn lower, and the family settles into the end of the day. Mago might go to sit with the boys from neighboring houses in the small courtyard, where the evening talk between young people has its own codes and concerns that are different from the talk of their parents. Tanit might ask to be told a story, and Elissa might tell one, or Hanno might tell one, depending on whose storytelling Tanit has decided she is in the mood for. The stories they tell are the old ones, the ones about the founding of the city, about Elissa the queen, called Dido by some, who sailed with her people from Tyre in the east, and came to this shore, and asked the local people for only as much land as she could enclose with a single ox hide, and then, being Elissa, cut the hide into strips and used those strips to enclose a whole hilltop, and on that hilltop built the citadel called the Bursa, which means the hide, and from that hilltop the city of Carthage grew. Tanit never tires of this story. She likes the cleverness of the hide cutting. She is, Elissa thinks, going to be exactly this kind of person herself. The night comes fully, and the city quiets its upper layers. The harbor is never entirely silent. because there are always night watches and arriving ships and the low sounds of work that never stops in a port city. But the residential streets grow quiet, and the sounds that remain are the sounds of domestic life winding down, a door closing, a lamp being extinguished, the last exchange of words between neighbors who have been talking over a shared wall. The dogs of the neighborhood conduct their own nightly assessment of the city's perimeter, moving in loose, purposeful groups through the darker alleys. The cats observe this from elevated positions with the expression of people watching a pantomime they have seen too many times to find interesting. Hanno lies down on his sleeping mat and pulls the light woolen cover over himself, though the night is warm enough that he will probably push it off by morning. Elissa lies down beside him. The lamp in the main room has been extinguished. The workshop is quiet, the clay pieces drying in their corner in the dark. Tanit is asleep in the back room, her breathing so regular and deep that it is almost audible, the breathing of a child who has spent all their body's energy on the serious business of being 7 years old. Mago has come in from the courtyard, later than he should have, by a margin that Elissa noted and filed away for morning, and is on his mat, and is probably not asleep. In the dark and the quiet, Hanno's mind does what minds do in the last moments before sleep. It moves over the day without intention or direction. The morning's clay, the particular satisfaction of the third jar of the morning, which came out as he wanted it. The neighbor at the fountain and the commission he should remember to think about further. The light on the harbor in the late afternoon, that particular gold. The dinner, the warmth of the lamp on his daughter's face while she examined her cup with the gravity of a philosopher examining a logical problem. The bronze pin he fastened in the morning, his father's pin, held for a moment longer than necessary. The sound of Elissa's breathing already moving towards sleep beside him. Outside, beyond the thick white walls, the city breathes in its own way. The harbor water moves against the stone of the quays in its small, eternal conversation. The night sky above Carthage is full of stars, more stars than you would believe if you saw them now from the midst of modern light pollution. Stars that the sailors name and navigate by, stars that the priests read for signs, stars that children count before they sleep, stars that have been there since before anyone in this city, before the city itself, before the first fire on the first hearth. They are there tonight, and they will be there tomorrow night, and the morning will come in its own time. The donkey first, then the footsteps, then the smell of smoke from the first fires, and Hanno will wake before the sun has quite risen and put on his tunic and fasten his father's pin and go to his wheel and wet his hands, and the day will begin again exactly as it began today, and as it will begin tomorrow, and as it has begun 10,000 times before in this city, and will begin 10,000 times again. The quiet, ordinary, unremarkable, absolutely irreplaceable daily life of a man who makes pots in a city by the sea, in a world that will eventually disappear so completely that historians will argue about which hill it stood on, but who is, tonight, as fully and completely alive as anyone who has ever lived, and whose sleep comes now, in the warm dark, in the city that is his, slowly, gently, without drama, the way all the best things come. Now, while Hanno sleeps and the city rests in its midnight quiet, let us walk a little further through the streets and visit some of the other lives that make up this place. Because a city is not one person. It is thousands of people, tens of thousands, each of them carrying the full weight of their own particular life. Each of them the center of their own ordinary story. Down near the harbor district, in a section of the city where the streets are wider and the buildings taller and the smells are more complex, there is a woman named Stefanaba who runs a tavern. The word tavern does not quite capture it. It is a place where wine is served and where food is available and where people sit on benches around low stone tables and stay for as long as they have something to talk about or money to spend, which in a port city can be quite a long time. Stefanaba is a woman in her middle 40s, with gray beginning at her temples and the bearing of someone who has spent 20 years managing situations that required managing and has become very good at it. She does not own the tavern in the simple way that one person owns one thing. She has an arrangement with the landowner, who is a man she has known for many years, and the arrangement is of the kind where the details are understood between the two parties and would take considerable explaining to anyone else. What is clear is that she runs the place, and has always run it, and that the tavern's good reputation and continuing business are directly attributable to her, which everyone in the neighborhood knows, including the landowner. The tavern serves several grades of wine. The best is a red wine from somewhere further east, brought in on the merchant ships and stored in the large amphorae that line the back wall. The middle grade is a local wine, made from grapes grown in the valleys behind the city, acceptable and honest. The cheapest is a thin mixture of wine and water, and sometimes a little of the sour wine called vinegar wine that sailors know well, which is the thing you drink when you want to feel like you are drinking without spending what it costs to drink. Stefanaba knows, with great precision, which of her customers needs which grade, and serves accordingly, not as a judgment, but as a form of tact. The tavern in the evening is a place of remarkable variety. There are sailors in from the ships, who drink with the focused efficiency of men who are on a schedule. There are dock workers who drink with the expansive relief of men who have finished a schedule. There are merchants who drink less than everyone else and watch more, and whose conversations, conducted in the low, close tones of people who have something to negotiate, are the real business of the establishment. There are locals who have been coming here for years, and who sit in the same places each time and drink the same wine and talk about the same subjects, and are as much a part of the tavern's furniture as the stone tables themselves. And occasionally there are strangers, people new to the city or passing through, who sit alone and look at everything with the alert, processing expression of someone in an unfamiliar place who is gathering information, and whom Stefanaba watches with the thoughtful attention of someone who has learned that strangers in a harbor tavern can be almost anything, and it is always worth knowing which thing they are before you engage too fully. She has, over the years, developed a system. She can tell within a few minutes of a person arriving what kind of person they are, not in any grand moral sense, but in the specific practical sense of whether they are going to pay at the end, whether they are going to start trouble, whether they are going to need to be told to leave before they have decided to leave, and whether they are the kind of customer who will come back and bring other people. This last kind is the most valuable, and Stefanaba treats them accordingly. A man who brings 3 friends with him every time he comes is worth more than a man who spends more money alone, and the arithmetic of this is something she understood long before she could have put it into words. Her evening ends late. After the last customers have gone, which is usually some time after the harbor bells have rung for the middle of the night watch, Stefanaba and her assistant, a young man named Abmelkart, whose name means servant of the god Melkart, and who has a gift for carrying large quantities of empty amphorae without breaking any of them, clean the tables, and put away the cups, and take account of the day's business. She counts the money with her fingers, moving over the coins in the way of a person for whom numbers are a physical sensation. There is bronze and silver, and occasionally a gold coin from some transaction she did not personally witness, but whose outcome she is satisfied with. The accounting takes the time it takes, and then she goes upstairs to the rooms above the tavern where she lives, and she is asleep before the thought of sleep has quite finished forming. Further along the curve of the harbor, in the direction of the old part of the city that was here before any of the current generation's grandparents were born, there is a temple. There are many temples in Carthage, because Carthage is a city of many gods, the old Phoenician gods brought from the east by the original settlers, the local North African deities absorbed over centuries of living alongside the Libyan people, the gods borrowed from trading partners. The Greek Demeter and Kore, who have been worshipped here under their Greek names and also under Punic equivalents for long enough that the distinction has become somewhat academic. But this particular temple, The great temple of Tanit and Balhaman is the most important. It is on the hill. It is large. It is served by a priesthood that has its own hierarchy and its own politics and its own daily life that is as much about administration and property management as about spiritual matters, which is true of the priesthood of every religion in every century and is one of those facts that surprises people who think about it for the first time and surprises nobody who has worked in any large institution. The priest who is most relevant to Hanno's neighborhood is not the high priest of the great temple on the hill, but a local figure, a minor priest named Arish who serves the small neighborhood shrine 3 streets from Hanno's house. Arish is a man of about 60, thin and precise in his movements, who smells of the particular incense burned at the shrine, and who has the manner of someone who has been trusted with a specific important task and takes it seriously without taking himself too seriously. His job, among other things, is to receive the small offerings that neighborhood residents bring to the shrine. The handful of grain, the small clay figurine, the little oil lamp left lit for the duration of the worship, the occasional more substantial offering of an animal, a dove or a small goat, on important occasions. He records these offerings, blesses the offerers, and manages the ongoing relationship between the neighborhood and its divine patrons with a bureaucratic thoroughness that would not be unfamiliar to anyone who has worked in a hospital or a municipal office. Hanno visits the shrine perhaps twice a week, sometimes more when there is something specific to bring to the god's attention, a concern about the kiln firing, a worry about Mago's health when the boy had a fever last winter, a question about whether to take on a large order from a distant client with whom he had not previously done business. He does not expect the gods to simply resolve these things for him. He has lived long enough to know that the world does not work that way. But the act of stating a concern formally, of bringing it into the space of the shrine and setting it down in front of something larger than himself, has a value that is more than superstition and less than certainty. It is the value of acknowledgement. The thing that worries you is real, and you have acknowledged it, and in acknowledging it you have done something with it rather than simply carrying it silently, which is the alternative, and the alternative, in Hanno's experience, is heavier. Elissa's relationship with the gods is different from Hanno's, more domestic and continuous and less formal. She maintains small sacred objects in the house, a clay figurine of Tanit on the shelf beside the cooking area, a sprig of dried herb renewed seasonally, a small oil lamp that she sometimes lights in the evening for no particular reason except that the act of lighting it feels like saying something that does not require words. She does not think of herself as especially pious. She thinks of herself as practical. The gods are part of the structure of the world, like the weather and the harvest and the sea, and you do not need to feel strongly about them to take reasonable account of them. This is the attitude of someone who has been living in a world with gods long enough to have developed a working relationship with the concept. On festival days, which come around with enough frequency that the city's rhythm is genuinely structured by them, the ordinary life of the neighborhood changes character. The workshops close earlier or not at all on these days. The street shrine is decorated with fresh flowers, or with the dried versions in winter, and with small colored cloth streamers that the children hang from the carved relief above the shrine's niche. There is music, which in this city means hand drums and double pipes, and the sistrums whose dry, shimmering rattling sound is the sound of ancient Mediterranean worship in the way that church bells are the sound of a later eras. There are processions, some of them grand and organized by the priests of the great temple on the hill, some of them small and neighborhood scale. A dozen people walking through the streets with a statue of the local divine patron carried on a wooden frame, stopping at intersections to perform the brief ritual gestures that each stopping place requires. Food is shared more freely on festival days. The taverns are full. The harbor does not stop its business for any festival, because the sea does not observe Carthaginian holidays. But even the sailors have been known to add a small additional offering to the shrine on the quayside when a festival day corresponds with a departure. The festivals mark the seasons as clearly as the weather does, in some ways more clearly, because in a Mediterranean climate the difference between seasons is sometimes subtle enough that you need the calendar to tell you the difference between late autumn and early winter, or between the very end of winter and the beginning of spring. The spring festival is the most joyful. After the rains of winter and the gray, sea-heavy skies, the spring festival arrives like a collective decision to be glad. The almond trees on the hillsides above the city bloomed first, white against the still brown hillside, and this blooming is itself taken as a sign, observed and noted, and the timing of the festival adjusted slightly by the priests to honor what is actually happening in the natural world rather than merely what the calendar says should be happening. This careful attention to the actual world, as opposed to the theoretical world described by official records, is one of the things that characterizes how this city, and perhaps every city, actually functions in its daily life, which is to say, messily, adaptively, and with a constant negotiation between what the rules say and what the situation requires. The children of Hanno's neighborhood spend the spring festival in a state of sustained happiness that is the gift of festival days to children in every century, which is the gift of ordinary rules being suspended. They eat things they are not usually allowed to eat at unusual times of day. They stay up later than they should. They run in the streets in groups of mixed ages, the older ones tolerating the younger ones with varying degrees of grace, the younger ones enduring the older one's authority with varying degrees of acceptance. Tanit, who is 7 and therefore at the age where festival freedom feels nearly overwhelming in its richness of possibility, spends the spring festival in a state of continuous motion from first morning to well past dark, and is carried to bed at the end of it by Hanno with the deep, peaceful unconsciousness of someone who has been as alive as it is possible to be for an entire day and has nothing left. Let us walk further, because there are more lives to visit in this city and the night is long and unhurried. Past the tavern district, past the temple precinct, past the markets that are quiet now in the late evening with their awnings rolled and their stone tables bare, past the craftsman streets where the sound of hammering metal has stopped and the kills have been banked for the night, past the larger houses on the upper streets where the merchant families live, where the courtyards are larger and the columns in the entrance halls are marble rather than whitewashed wood, and where the evening meals have more courses and the wine is better, but where the oil lamps cast the same warm light on the same warm human faces, past all of this, to the harbor edge, where the night watch sits on the stone bollards and watches the water. The harbor at night is not the harbor of the day. In the day it is noise and color and constant movement. At night it is something quieter and larger. The dark water holds the reflection of whatever lights burn on the ships, the small oil lamps at the ship's bows, the larger lanterns hung at the entries to the covered ship sheds in the naval harbor. The smell is the same but louder somehow in the quiet, the salt and the tar, and the long complicated smell of the sea and everything that lives in it, and everything that has been carried across it. The watchkeeper on the commercial harbor quay is a man named Bodo, which is not a Punic name but a Libyan one, because his father was Libyan and his mother was from the Carthaginian citizen class, and their marriage was the kind of story that people told with different emphasis depending on which family they knew better. Bodo is in his 30s. He has been doing this night watch for 8 years. He is good at being awake in the quiet and at noticing the things that are slightly wrong in a way that takes experience to develop. He has never found anything seriously wrong, which he takes as evidence either that he is good at his job or that nothing seriously wrong has happened to find, and he is not sure which is more likely. He watches the water and the ships and the dark shape of the city behind him on its hill, with the citadel visible at the top against the stars, and he is thinking, in the loose, unpressured way of someone whose work tonight is mainly the work of being present, about his son who is 3 years old, and who said something funny this morning at breakfast that Bodo cannot quite reconstruct, but that made him laugh out loud in the way that only very young children can make you laugh, the laugh that comes not from wit, but from the sheer surprise of a new mind encountering the world and saying something completely true about it from a completely unexpected angle. The city sleeps. Not all of it, because a city this size is never entirely asleep, but most of it, and the part that sleeps does so in the way of people who have used the day up fully, the honest sleep of work and cooking and children and lamplight, and the small accumulated satisfactions and frictions of a life lived in close company with other lives. The potter sleeps. The priestess at the neighborhood shrine sleeps, in her small room behind the shrine itself, with her formal garments laid carefully over the wooden stand in the corner and her sandals set side by side below it. The tavern keeper sleeps. The merchant in his larger house on the hill sleeps, though less peacefully, because his mind has a habit of running accounts in the hours before dawn. The old scholar sleeps with a book open on his chest, a papyrus scroll that is rolled slightly closed from his relaxed hands. The water carrier sleeps beside his donkey in the stable that is half his sleeping quarters, in the companionable way of people and animals that have worked together long enough to be genuinely comfortable in each other's presence. Tanit sleeps with her mouth slightly open and one hand spread flat beside her on the mat, as if ready to start sorting pebbles the moment she wakes up. Mago lies on the boundary between sleep and waking, the place where the thoughts of the day become the beginning thoughts of tomorrow, and then he too crosses over. The morning will come. It always does. The donkey will call. The first footsteps will sound on the cobblestones. The smell of the first fire will drift up from somewhere below. Hanno will reach for his tunic. Elissa will have set out bread. The city will seep, rather than explode, into another day. And the day will be, in all its essential qualities, very much like today. Not identical, because no 2 days are exactly identical even when they are trying to be, but similar in the deep, structural way of days that are built on the same foundation of necessity and habit and small pleasure and quiet work and the particular human satisfaction of a life that, even if it will not be remembered, is being fully lived. This is what history forgets. History remembers the generals and the campaigns and the great fires and the famous sieges. It remembers the years and the battles and the names of the powerful. But it forgets this: the jar drying in the corner of the workshop, the lentils in the beautiful jar, Tanit's sorted pebbles, the father's bronze pin, the cold water from the fountain on a hot afternoon, Bodo watching the harbor water hold the reflection of a small lamp, the laugh that a 3-year-old causes at breakfast by saying something completely true. History forgets these things, but they happened. They happened as fully and completely as any battle, as any treaty, as any year that got a name in the records. They happened every day, in every house, on every street, in every city that has ever stood on the edge of the sea and watched the morning come in over the water. And knowing that they happened, knowing that Hanno existed and potted his clay and ate his lentils and touched his father's pin and listened to his son think and watched his daughter sort pebbles, knowing this does not change any of the grand sweep of history. But it does change something. It changes the texture of what we mean when we say the word history at all. Now let us continue through the days of Hanno's life and the life of the city. Let us follow the weeks through the seasons, because a day is only the smallest unit of an ordinary life. A week is where patterns emerge. A month is where the rhythms of work and rest and market and festival become visible as the structure that holds everything else up. The work week in ancient Carthage is not the week we know, the 7-day week of Sunday rest and Monday back to it. The Carthaginian calendar is organized around different rhythms. The rhythms of the market, which meets on specific days, the rhythms of the religious calendar, which specifies which days are appropriate for which activities, and the rhythms of the natural world, the tides, the seasons of the fish, the planting and harvest cycles that govern the lives of the farmers in the countryside outside the city walls, even if the city dwellers experience them mainly as changes in what is available at the market. Market day is the axis around which much of Hanno's working life turns. He spends the days between markets preparing his stock, selecting the best pieces from the drying shelves, loading them into the wide, flat baskets lined with straw that protect the unfired but leather-hard pieces, or, for the fired goods, the simple straw-padded boxes that keep them from knocking against each other and cracking. His market stall is a low wooden table in the pottery section of the main market, near the other potters, which means that the buyers who come looking for pottery can compare his work against his neighbor's work, which sounds disadvantageous, but in practice is fine because Hanno's work is consistently good, and because the kind of buyer who goes to the pottery market and compares carefully before buying is also the kind of buyer who recognizes good work and is willing to pay for it. The pottery market section smells of clay even on days when the clay is all fired and done, because the smell has soaked into the wood of the tables and the fabric of the awnings over many years. The other potters Hanno shares this section with include Sidon, an older man who specializes in storage amphory of the large type and who does a steady business with the harbor district, the big handles of his amphory ideal for ship storage. There is a woman named Miriam who makes the delicate small lamps that are needed in every household and burns through her stock in each market session. There is a young man, barely 20, who is new to the market and who makes technically competent but artistically conservative work that sells at the lower end of the price range, and will continue to do so until he either develops a distinctive approach or decides that technical competence at a fair price is itself a perfectly adequate way to spend a life, which is not a failure of ambition but simply a different kind of success. Hanno's specialty, if he has one, is the medium-sized household vessel, the water jar, the wine storage amphora, the wide-mouthed cooking pot, the forms that people use every day and that need to be both functional and not ugly. He does not make the elaborate painted or decorated ware that some potters specialize in, the pieces with geometric patterns in red and black that sell at a premium to wealthier buyers. He has tried this style and found it technically within his ability, but temperamentally not his thing. He prefers the clean, unadorned form, the curve of a jar that is beautiful because it is right for its purpose, not because it has been dressed up to seem more valuable than it is. There is a market for this. The households that buy his work are the households of people who have enough to spend on something well-made, but not so much that they buy things primarily as statements of wealth. They are, in other words, the households of people very much like himself, and he understands their needs with the precision of shared experience. The market day itself is long. Hanno sets up before the first buyers arrive, which means rising earlier than usual, loading the donkey that he borrows from the neighbor with the stable, making the short trip through the waking streets to the market, setting up the table and arranging the pieces, and then standing or sitting in the increasing noise and heat of the market for most of the day. He takes a break at midday when a neighbor watches his stall in exchange for a future reciprocal arrangement, goes to buy himself a cup of something cold and a piece of flat bread from the food sellers who work the edges of the market, eats standing up watching the crowd. The market crowd is its own education in the city. You see, over the course of a market day, something approaching a cross-section of the whole city's population, from the wealthy matron attended by a slave, carrying her purchases, to the desperately poor woman pricing the cheapest grain and calculating in her head whether the calculation works. You see the whole social geography of the city in miniature, with its hierarchies and transactions and moments of connection and collision. Hanno sells well on most market days. He sometimes does not sell everything he brought, and he goes home with the remainder, which is fine. Those pieces go back on the display and wait for next time. He sometimes sells out before the day ends, which is a problem of a different kind because it means he is standing at a table with nothing to sell, and people are looking at it with the slightly disappointed expression of someone who came for something specific and found it gone. He is working on producing more consistently, which is itself a constraint on quality that he navigates carefully, because producing more requires either working faster, which produces worse work, or working longer, which is not infinitely sustainable. The business of making and selling things by hand has exactly this tension at its center, and it is not a tension that resolves. It is a tension that you manage day by day, season by season, and that is itself, in a strange way, one of the things that makes the work interesting. The money from the market day goes into the clay pot that Elissa keeps on the high shelf in the back room of the house. The pot that is too plain and old to be the kind of pot Hanno would sell at market, but that is exactly the right size and weight and closing lid tightness for the purpose it serves. The family's financial life is not quite comfortable and not quite precarious, which is the condition of most of the city's artisan class, and managing it is a matter of knowing exactly where on that spectrum you are at any given moment and making the adjustments that keep you from drifting too far toward the precarious side. Elissa knows this. Hanno knows this. They have the kind of partnership in this matter that comes from years of shared necessity. The seasons change. Summer deepens and then begins, almost imperceptibly, to ease. The afternoons are still hot, but the evenings come a little sooner, the light a little less brutal. The quality of light changes, which Hanno notices through the high window of the workshop, where the summer light is almost white and the autumn light, when it comes, has more gold in it, more warmth and less blaze. The sea changes color with the seasons too, moving from the hard, bright blue of high summer to a deeper, greener blue in autumn, and the fishermen know this and adjust what they are fishing for accordingly. The fish market in autumn has different abundance than the summer market. More mackerel running in the cooler water, the tuna migration passing south, the purple-spined sea urchins at their best in the months of the autumn equinox. Autumn brings the olive harvest, which affects the city in ways that may not be immediately obvious unless you think about how central olive oil is to everything in this world. The cooking, the lighting, the skincare, the industrial uses in the workshops and on the ships. The olive groves are outside the city, in the hills and valleys of the territory under Carthaginian control, and the harvest is a time of organized labor that draws workers from the city's labor pool as well as from the farming communities directly. The oil that results is pressed in the olive presses, which are massive stone constructions that you can hear and smell from some distance on pressing day. And the oil is stored in large clay jars, many of them made by potters like Hanno, and distributed through the trading networks that are the circulatory system of the city's economy. Hanno's workshop occasionally receives large orders around the olive harvest season, because storage needs increase and the harbor trade in oil picks up and people need the vessels. A large order for storage jars from one of the harbor district merchants is an event that changes the rhythm of the workshop for weeks. More clay to prepare, more firings of the kiln, more of Mago's afternoon time recruited to help with the less skilled parts of the preparation work, more of Elissa's time managing the logistics of delivery. It is demanding. It is also, when it goes well, profitable in a way that puts more coins in the clay pot on the high shelf and lets Elissa do the mental accounting with a slightly different expression on her face, the expression of someone whose calculation has come out better than expected. Winter in Carthage is not the winter of northern cities. There is no snow, usually, though the mountains visible to the south on very clear days have snow on them in the depths of the cold season. The winter here is rainy, gray, sea-heavy, with a damp that gets into the walls of houses and into the joints of hands that have been working clay all their lives. The harbor is less busy in winter because open sea sailing is dangerous in the storms that can come up suddenly in the winter Mediterranean, and most captains keep their ships in harbor from early winter to early spring, a period the Romans will later call mare clausum, the closed sea, though that language has not been invented yet, and the concept is just the universal sailor's wisdom about not crossing deep water in February. The harbor workers are less employed. The sailors are in the city and spending their accumulated wages on wine and food and housing. And the city has a slightly different character in winter, more settled, more turned inward on itself. Hanno's workshop slows in winter too, because the firing of the kiln in cold, damp weather is less reliable, because the clay dries more slowly in the wet air, and because the buyers at the winter market are fewer and more deliberate in their spending. He uses the slower season to do things the busy season does not allow, to repair tools, to experiment with a clay mixture that a traveling potter mentioned to him in the summer, to work on his own skill in new directions without the pressure of production. He makes, in the winter, the pieces he makes for no one, the jar that is not for sale, the bowl that he shapes just to see if he can shape it, the oil lamp that he gives to Elissa in the end, because it came out exactly as he wanted, and she might as well use it rather than have it sit on a shelf. Elissa's winter is the season of weaving. She is a skilled weaver, and the weaving cooperative she works with, a group of perhaps 8 women who share a loom in the house of the oldest among them, and divide the work and the income according to contributions, produces cloth that sells at the market and is sometimes taken by the harbor merchants on commission. The cloth they make is woolen, dyed in the vegetable dyes available locally, and it is good solid cloth that lasts and serves and wears well rather than the luxury cloth, the brilliant purple from the murex shellfish that is Carthage's most famous export, which is made elsewhere by different craftswomen with access to the enormous quantities of shellfish that the purple production requires and with the social connections to sell it in the markets where the wealthy shop. The winter evenings are longer and the lamp burns longer, and Mago has more time for the reading that he has come to prefer over most other activities, which surprises Hanno slightly, because he did not read as a child in the way his son reads, with the absorbed and slightly distant manner of someone who is somewhere else even while sitting right there. The books that Mago reads are clay tablets with impressed text, or papyrus scrolls borrowed from the school or from a neighbor who has a small collection. They are books of accounts and trade records, which Mago finds interesting in the way that some people find puzzles interesting, and also occasionally the historical records and the stories of the city's founding, which everyone knows in their oral form, but which seeing written down makes feel different, more fixed and certain, like something that has been decided rather than something still in conversation with itself. Tanit does not read yet, or rather she is at the very beginning of reading, the stage where the marks on the clay or papyrus are beginning to connect to the sounds you already know and the words you already use, and the gap between the written and the spoken is becoming something you can jump across, most of the time, with effort. She is frustrated by this stage, as most people are, because it is a stage where you can see what reading is but cannot yet do it fluently, like knowing what swimming looks like, but still swallowing water half the time. Hanno is patient with this. Elissa is patient and also systematic in a way that produces results, identifying the specific places where Tanit gets stuck and working on those places specifically rather than going over what Tanit already knows, which is a teaching method that would not surprise any good modern educator, but that feels, when you watch Elissa do it, less like pedagogy and more like paying attention to a specific person. Spring returns. It always returns. The almond trees bloom first, and then the other fruit trees, and then the wildflowers in the fields outside the city walls come up in their profligate abundance, the red poppies and the yellow things, and the small blue flowers whose name Tanit has asked about 3 times and that no one in the family seems to know. The harbor, which has been waiting through the winter with the patient readiness of a harbor, comes alive again. The first ships of the season put out from the harbor in the earliest days of the navigable weather, when the captains who have been watching the stars and the winds decide that the risk has become acceptable, and the departure of the first ship is itself a small ceremony. Watched from the harbor walls by people who have an interest in its cargo, and people who have an interest in its safe arrival somewhere, and people who just like watching ships go. The city's spring cleaning is a phenomenon that has equivalents in every culture in every era, and that in Carthage takes the form of a general freshening and whitewashing and repairing that the whole neighborhood undertakes with varying degrees of enthusiasm in the first warm weeks. Walls are replastered. Courtyards are swept of the winter's accumulation of leaves and silt. The whitewash is applied with wide brushes, making the street look, for a few days, almost painfully clean and bright before the dust and the handprints and the small, inevitable scars of daily life begin to accumulate again. Hanno whitewashes the front of his house himself, with Mago doing the upper sections that require the small wooden ladder, and the result is satisfying in the specific way that visible improvement of a thing you own is satisfying. It looks clean. It looks cared for. It looks like a house where people live and pay attention. On a spring morning, perhaps 3 weeks into the real warmth of the new season, Hanno finishes a jar that he has been working on in the slow winter months, refining, letting sit, going back to it, altering the shoulder, adjusting the lip. It is a storage jar, wider in the middle than at the neck, with 2 handles that attach at points he has calculated for strength and elegance simultaneously. The clay he used for it is the best clay from his supply, the batch that came from the inland deposit that he walks to 3 times a year to collect himself, which has a particular texture and a particular firing color that he cannot get from the clay the market dealers supply. The firing, done on a cool morning when the kiln conditions were as good as they ever are, has produced a color in the clay that ranges from the pale yellow of the outer surface to the darker orange-red of the interior, visible where the clay is thin enough. He holds it in both hands in the morning light of the workshop doorway, turning it slowly. It is the jar he was trying to make. Not perfect, because nothing is perfect, but right. The curve of it is what he intended. The handles are what he intended. The weight of it in the hands is exactly the weight that says, "This was made to be used, and it will be used well." He puts it on the shelf beside the window. He does not put it with the market stock. He does not put it with the second-quality pieces. He puts it on the shelf beside the window where the morning light will find it, and he leaves it there and goes back to the wheel and begins again. This is the quiet daily life of an ordinary citizen of ancient Carthage. Not a general, not a merchant prince, not a priest with power. A man who makes pots, in a city by the sea, in a world long gone. A man whose name we do not know, because the names of ordinary people were not written into the records that survived, but whose life we can know, in its shape and texture and rhythm, because the things that make up an ordinary human life are not the kind of things that require writing down to have been real. The clay he touched was real. The morning he woke to was real. The jar on the shelf is real, or was, once, in a workshop in a city on a coast in a world that smelled of salt water and cedar and figs warming in the sun. You are lying down. Your breathing has slowed. The images behind your eyes, if there are any, are gentle ones. Cobblestones warm in the morning, a fountain at an intersection, the gold light of evening on white walls. You do not need to hold on to any of it. It will be there if you want it. Next time you close your eyes and let the quiet old world come up around you. But for now, you can let it go. The potter is asleep. The city is asleep. The harbor water moves in its small, eternal conversation with the stone. The stars are very bright and very old. And you are here, which is exactly where you need to be. Let everything be still. Let everything be slow. Let the ancient dark come in, gentle as it always has been, quiet as the long history of ordinary nights. Sleep now. Everything is fine. Everything has always been fine. And it will be fine again tomorrow, when the donkey calls before dawn, and the day begins again, in the warm and ancient light.